Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Yim, and I am president of PLS and supervising librarian at the New York Public Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our last session of Combating Racism in Libraries. Today's topic is teaching equity, diversity, inclusion, and American culture in ESOL classes. Like Jeremy said, today's session is supported by PLS and ESRT. PLS is the public library section of NYLA. It is dedicated to supporting public libraries and public library staff of New York State. Our goal is to help sustain and improve libraries and library services by providing continuing education opportunities, conference programming, awards, scholarships, advocacy, and by supporting key NYLA initiatives. ESRT is the Ethnic Services Roundtable of NYLA. It is focused on ethnic services, specifically on sharing information through a cooperative network, developing and promoting related collections, designing services, and providing up-to-date funding information. As such, I am so pleased to welcome Joanne Wong, who is a general librarian at Queens Public Library at Hunters Point. She is also a member at large for ESRT and second vice president for PLS. So without further ado, Joanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for that introduction. And Jeremy, thank you so much for helping to set up this webinar series. So our main event, of course, is our speakers today. So I want to first give a big shout out to both Shenzhan and Andrea and give you some little information about them before we officially get started with our wonderful discussion that we're going to have today. So first, I would like to introduce Andrea Honigsfeld. She is the Associate Dean and Director of the Doctoral Program Educational Leadership for Diverse Learning Communities at Molloy College, Rockville Center, New York. Before entering the field of higher education, she was an English as a foreign language teacher in Hungary for grades 5 to 8 and for adults, and English as a second language teacher in New York City for grades K to 3 and adults, and taught Hungarian at New York University. A Fulbright scholar and sought after national presenter, Andrea is the co-author or co-editor of over 20 books on education and numerous chapters and research articles related to the needs of diverse learners. I would also like to introduce Shenzhan Liao, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of the School of Chinese Studies of China Institute. A Chinese native, Ms. Liao oversees all educational programs at China Institute, including language and cultural learning for children and adults, professional development for K-12 educators, as well as programs designed for the general public and schools to learn about the experience and learn and experience Chinese language and culture through collaborations with the New York City Cultural Affairs and New York City Department of Education. Ms. Liao frequently speaks on cultural and educational topics related to China for students, professionals of various backgrounds, as well as US and Chinese media, including the New York Times, Fox 5, Sinovision, and so China. As a volunteer, she has also been one of the founding and integral organizers for the Hunters Point ESOL virtual conversation group that started in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm so excited to be here with both you, Shenzhan, and Andrea. And so we're just gonna get right into it. So we're gonna start with a really big question, and I'm gonna ask first Shenzhan, but Andrea, feel free to jump in with your thoughts on this one as well. The big question, what is American culture in the context of these ESOL classrooms?
I will start to answer this daunting question, but before I answer the question, I want to express my gratitude and appreciation to Queens Public Library and to Joanne, particularly to invite me to join this panel with Andrea. It's my honor, and also to have this opportunity to share my thoughts and voice. I would say not necessarily as any expert on this particular question or the topic, but also, but more of sharing my thoughts and voices first as an immigrant myself to the United States about a decade ago, based on my experience and what and how I can, as an individual, join the discussions and discourse, as it's such an important topic, especially in today's world. And two, as Joanne mentioned, I work at China Institute. My profession gave me the opportunity to work with a lot of teachers, especially K-12 Chinese language teachers, many of whom have students who are immigrants. So even though I'm not in the United States teaching ESL a lot in the classroom, but I hope all this experience can contribute to the discussion today. So coming back to the question, Joanne, you mentioned what is American culture? I want to start from when I was in China, because I was studying English as a student. And the American culture really, well, it comes through very concrete cultural content, the films, the music, rock and roll, Grammys, and of course, well, the kind of openness and dynamic of the democratic system that opens up a very different path and opportunities for people like me in China with a very different social, political, economic system. I was curious, I was intrigued. So that's one of the main reasons I come to the United States when I pursue my graduate study. And after I came, I found it's really so much more. The complexity, the different communities based on different ethnic groups or cultures, and how dynamic that these different cultures would interrelate as well as negotiate with each other. That I find it's really unique coming from my background, understanding growing up in China, understanding Chinese culture, which is dynamic on its own. But American culture, to me, really having this kind of openness and the almost, I would say, endless possibilities to negotiate as a group and as individuals. So I feel it could result in two, I would say in two parts. One is, well, it opens to this unlimited possibility if we allow ourselves to be open, to be vulnerable, and to learn from each other. I feel it's related to today's topic very much. But on the other hand, it also could mean that, well, we may stay in our own bubble, and that generates barriers to understand each other. So I find, well, that's a very abstract way of talking about American culture, but this is what I first want to share, and I would like to make more comments as we talk more in the classroom.
And thank you so much, Shenzhen. And actually, I'm going to piggyback off what you said. You know, with here, you know, it's a lot of learning and you know, exploring the openness and options, and but also trying not to create any barriers in the process. And so, Andrea, I wanted to kind of direct the next question to you. Is, you know, especially, you know, with current events, you know, ESOL classrooms do not exist in a vacuum. And so when we are teaching English as a second language, what are ways that we can bring current events into the classroom and make sure that these barriers are not something that become prevalent in someone here?
Thank you so much for that question. And I too would like to acknowledge the organization and my gratitude for being here and being on this panel with Shenzhen Liao. Did I say your name correctly? Yes. I think we're all representing various cultures and identities and the complexities of the immigrant experience. As you could probably detect the accent in my voice, I too am a newcomer to the United States and coming from a highly collectivistic culture, which is the Eastern European cultures in general, and entering into the complex and wonderfully rich, but a lot more individualistic American culture, which I also experienced, of course, as a culture shock. So yes, we could continue talking more about the culture, but I really liked your question that I'd like to continue with, which is understanding the current events are really, really important for our immigrant populations or our children of immigrants if you're working with younger children. And there are a number of tools out there that I'd like to immediately recommend that also acknowledges the different levels of proficiencies, the students' abilities and language proficiencies that they could access to current events. Two of my favorites are News ELA and newsinlevels.com, which provide the same article on multiple language proficiency levels. So our students can read and talk about the very same things that are on the news, but might be too fast to follow, or published in the New York Times or any other national newspaper, but might be, again, very difficult to decode and decipher. So these two resources are fabulous. Another very accessible way that we can bring current events into the classroom is simply selecting some photographs, some illustrations from newspapers, from online, from digital resources, and allow our students to engage in the picture word induction method, that's PWIM, and asking the students to simply respond to the image, which sometimes could be, of course, very shocking if you are giving them a current event, how a tornado destroyed something, or COVID-related events. So there's just so many very vivid images that we could use in the classroom. So inviting students to brainstorm, and every single word that they can identify in that picture should be then jotted down or even annotated on that picture. The next is the sentence level work with our English learners, is to try to put those words together, try to describe, narrate, argue a point of view, or offer an opinion about that image, and then bringing it to the discourse level, which is more paragraph level or even longer, either oral or written discourse that's connected to that image. So you don't have to go too far. A single image, we could spend an hour or 2 hours and build language as well as understanding current events at the level that our students are comfortable with.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. And so I also wanted to kind of bump that question to Shenzhen as well, especially I know you've been doing this ESOL conversation group during COVID-19, and those conversations have resulted in very interesting discussions among participants. So I kind of wanted to see your view too as well, kind of going off of what Andrea was saying, of how we learn in these conversations and go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. As well, Andrea was talking about the wonderful resources. I'm like joining it down myself because I want to learn that as well. I'm also thinking about our students, they are living in today's world, and the events that's happening to them, these are the life-related experience that they can also bring to their classrooms, and how they feel and react to the current events. I remember, Joanne, when we were organizing the conversational group, one part I enjoyed the most was every individual student, when they were talking about their own reaction, their frustration, their worries about the current situation, how they feel about the COVID-19. These are the real events happening. And if we can build that connection, and while talking about what languages you can use to talk about your own experience and how that's related to the larger or bigger narrative and events that's happening right now, I find, well, that maybe also help to build that relevance.
Agreed. And so in terms of what you were saying, so that kind of brings me into my next question, is that when we talk about current events and we talk about the experiences of our students, we can't separate that from equity, diversity, and inclusion in our ESOL classrooms. And so, Andrea, would you like to take a stab at that question first?
Absolutely. And I'd like to piggyback on what Shenzhen just said, that we need to acknowledge our students' lived experiences. we need to acknowledge both their tremendous funds of knowledge, funds of identity, the rich, complex cultural backgrounds that they bring to the United States and to the classroom more specifically, and at the same time, allowing them to share both their personal and larger experiences with bias, prejudice, discrimination, and allowing them to maybe keep a personal journal, being able to write or maybe create a short play in which they act out and work through challenging situations, and even giving them the language, the actual appropriate way to respond and challenge people if they are experiencing any kind of bias and discrimination, and how to strengthen their agency that, yes, you have to speak up for yourself and for others who are being discriminated against. So I think it is a very real experience that we have to acknowledge and build a lesson around it and incorporate these challenges into our classrooms.
And so to continue off of that, especially when we're talking about EDI, one of the things that we also have to acknowledge is about race. And so this is, I think, especially in an ESOL classroom, it's a very interesting topic because we talk about race in America, but then also potential discrimination that immigrants are also facing. And it's two things that overlap. And so I'm going to leave this open to whoever's interested in answering this question first. But another big question, how do we talk about race to our students who are learning English in our classrooms?
Can I just to jump in? First, I want to also follow up on what Andrea mentioned, the previous question, equity, diversity, inclusion, as well on the experience that I feel every individual brings to the classroom. There are so many different layers, and also related to the question that Joanne, you just asked about race, because especially when we when we are facing English language learners, their experience as immigrants, and how to build that sense of equity, and how to really show the respect of diversity, and create an environment, whether in the classroom or school or the larger community and inclusion. I feel there has to be concrete ways that's in place to be able to empower students and teachers to do that. So one part I feel is, this is in part related to the work that I do, to bring the culture that the students in their personal background or from the culture that they are from into the classroom, into the discourse, and to show that kind of respect, I feel is extremely important. And that's the beginning of the understanding. Just an example, we have classes that's about Chinese classical literature for adults at China Institute. And once after the class, a student who's a Chinese American who doesn't really learning Chinese language and also the classical literature in English with us. And he said, "Thank you for this class. Now I know so much more about the literature tradition and the culture that's coming from China. I feel like so proud of that culture." And similarly, we have a workshop series talking about Forbidden City, the history, the different traditions while going into Chinese culture that go beyond perhaps the surface understanding of Chinese culture in a somewhat stereotypical way here, going down a little bit in depth of the surface to understand what's underneath it. And when students, these are like fifth graders, sixth graders, or third graders, we brought them to dual language classroom or ESL classroom. after they really having fun with the culture, with the content, and the students themselves feel, wow, this is the kind of culture that I have some connection, and I feel really the pride coming from that. And for other students really develop that kind of understanding, I feel this is the beginning of the of building that equity among different ethnic groups and among different races as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Shenzhan. And Andrea, do you have thoughts on that question as well, of how do we talk about race to our students?
Sure, absolutely. So a very simple way, again, I'm combining the conceptually what we're discussing, as well as how to present that linguistically to our ESOL learners. So one way that I'm thinking immediately is this saying when somebody says, I'm not a racist. And we heard that, and we're not going to go really deep into where we heard that and who said that and why they said that. But what is the difference between somebody saying, I am not a racist, or I am an anti-racist? So differentiating between individual and societal level racism, anti-immigrant sentiments, as opposed to anti-immigrant policies. So you could certainly look at and unpack, I am not a racist, that sentence, what's behind that, and how can you be actively anti-racist, being against racist policies, racist sentiments, racist expressions of ideas and thoughts, and collect examples from the students' own experiences of how they have experienced racism and anti-racism. And that's also connecting to the idea of all the different movements that are emerging in our society, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, and connecting everything to current events. So it's all meaningful for our students because they must have experienced some form of racism or discrimination, or simply racializing them. And I can give you an example of what is. Before I came to the United States, I wasn't white. I was Hungarian. I became white when I came to this country. So how we identify as immigrants coming from another place through our ethnic identities, but in a racialized society, we are now in racial categories on top of our own ethnic categories too. So this is just a very, very interesting, complex issue that I would start talking to students first from the individual perspective of trying to define our own identities. How do you describe yourself? What are those labels that you put on yourself? And what labels do other people put on you? So that's just one way that we could open up the conversation with our ESOL students around these topics.
And so speaking about opening the conversation, you mentioned movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. So in terms of, keeping with current events and see and learning more about what is happening within our areas, what are ways that you would suggest broaching that conversation in an ESOL classroom or in an ESOL conversation group?
We could certainly look at, circling back to your previous question, to current events. So we need to contextualize these conversations, especially if you're working with recently arrived immigrant students who might not understand what is really being happening in the United States in the past year, the past decade, and before, and offering them a simple timeline. So making it very visual, very accessible. So we could look at the timeline on how race and racism evolved in the United States. We could certainly offer a timeline on immigration policies so that they see contextually what has been going on in this country, so that you're appealing to the intellect. And then you could also appeal to the affect by maybe reading poetry and looking at short video clips and movie clips and songs that capture different trends and anti-racist movements in the United States.
Just want to also follow up on that. Understanding the context, I find it so important for new immigrants, students, as well as teachers. I just remember when this summer, it's just everything was so politically charged especially following Floyd's death, unfortunate death, and the whole social movement that's ramping through the entire society. Then I started to really dig into a little bit more of the history of the Black Americans, well, history, well, just still at the very beginning, understanding, and it's for the first time that I'm turning into what is this Reconstruction era, what's happening after the Civil War, and well, when different people are talking about the real freedom is not just in conceptual way, that everybody is equal, we treat each other, respect, but there are real social systems that underpin what has been in place and for hundreds of years, well, since 17th century, the slavery started. So to have more understanding of that context, I find it really helps me to understand why there's such a charged, very intense, and to a certain degree, we saw violence broke out in different places. Because, well, there has been a long history that's particularly related to Black Americans, African Americans in this country. And also there are connections and interrelations with other racial groups as well. So, well, to me, while looking at, well, there's a natural sort of direction leading me looking at Chinese American experience, the kind of discrimination that as a group, as an ethnic group, was since perhaps the most famous one was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. That was the first law in the United States that banned the entry of Chinese based on the race. And it has been in place for a long time, that only until, well, 1950s, 1965, that it was completely banned. So it was a long history, and it's not just that the race question is not just a black and white question, but it's really fundamentally, well, how looking at the different timelines, different context, that both historically and how that's related to the current events that's happening. Of course, well, depending on the student's age and we cannot just put everything into the classroom, and teachers have to really select the right materials and the right methods to bring that into the classroom. And on the other hand, well, teachers need to be, and like from my own experience, I want to be educated so that I know what's going on, because I cannot talk about things that I don't know in the classroom. So these are, I feel like, really interrelated, that hopefully there could be a way that we can concretely talk about and bring that to classrooms.
And so Shenzhen, you know, as you said, you know, learning context is really important to understand our current events. And you know, one of the best ways to really introduce this to our students is through educating our teachers. So I know that you had been working on some professional development with teachers at your own organization. I was wondering if you wanted to maybe say a few words on what that is.
Thank you. Yes, so we meaning through China Institute, we've been organizing professional development workshops for Chinese language teachers in collaboration with DOE, with the New York State Education Department, and also universities and other educational institutes. So at the beginning, we were focusing on pedagogy, curriculum design, how to make teaching the language successful in the classroom. But especially during this time, we have been feeling the increasing needs of addressing not just the linguistic and the pedagogy matters in classroom for these professional development, but really looking at the larger social context. So in April, when the whole pandemic started, we actually had a workshop focusing on social emotional learning. And that's naturally related to how students and teachers feel about the current events. And there were discussions really bringing up, well, not only this is a stressful time, how teachers are leveraging different techniques to teach online. Suddenly, everybody has to be online teaching expert, managing technology and pedagogy and content beautifully. On the other hand, because, well, this is also related to the virus that started in China coming here. So this whole anti-Asian or anti-Chinese sentiment is rising. So when our teachers are talking about the social emotional learning, that kind of frustration and also the concern brought into the discussion. Well, so it becomes not only just a teaching, it's really how to address the issues from a social emotional perspective and to bring that perspective into the discussion. And another part I want to quickly talk about is we are looking to a framework, culturally responsive way of looking at students, teachers, and the community. And it really, while the classroom or the school is this focal point of connecting individuals, community, and in the larger society, and how to do that in a culturally responsive way, because that framework would be as a tool to provide the framework, the resources to look at how to understand each other, how to bring the cultures that the students bring with them through their background and families into the classroom, and how we can talk about that. And if we encounter different attitudes based on different value opinions towards those cultures or behaviors. So these are the professional development that there is a natural trajectory coming from very concrete way of how to conduct classes and curriculum successfully to the classroom is not in a vacuum. And we really need to connect both with the students as well as, well, the teachers needs to be connected with the larger, in the larger way as well. So these are the kind of professional development we are currently planning and hopefully reaching to teachers more than just the Chinese language teachers, because, well, it is universal and across board.
And Andrea, how about your thoughts too as well in terms of professional development that is needed for teachers in this context?
Actually, I have just posted one resource that I have contributed to as an expert advisor. It's published by the New York State Department of Education, and it is a culturally responsive and sustaining education framework, very similar to what you just heard about. So the CRSE is accessible for anybody around the United States, and you could certainly examine and implement the principles as well as the practices of that framework. I couldn't agree with you more that our job has been more difficult than ever before, because we're combining pedagogy, we're combining technology, as well as we function in a very challenging, difficult context because of one pandemic, that's the COVID, and the other one is the continued experiences with racism and discrimination that's happening in the United States. So one way that I would recommend professional development for all educators would be to build on an asset-based philosophy. and start with their own identities, start examining their own diverse culturally and linguistically rich backgrounds, and build from that asset, as well as recognize the assets in their students rather than the deficiencies or deficits that might be perceived that they bring to the classroom. I've also published several books with Maria Dove and Audrey Cohen on teacher collaboration, so I can't help but recommend that line of professional development as well, because the job is so challenging, our situation is so difficult. So one way that we could be more effective is if we collaborate, if we combine our expertise, just like on this panel, you have multiple speakers, this entire webinar series, you have so many different perspectives that you are able to bring together. Professional development around teacher collaboration or educator collaboration, librarian collaboration is really important.
And so, Andrea, you said just the key word I was waiting to hear, library collaboration. And so, libraries have always worked really hard in trying to provide resources and classes and conversation groups for ESOL learners. And so I'll start with you, Andrea, is just how can libraries better serve our non-English speakers with providing these types of resources?
Yeah, I think you already are doing an amazing job. My experience is that you're not only creating a safe haven where families, where parents of children who go to schools but would not have access to high quality ESOL classes, they can go to the local libraries and receive those classes there. My understanding is that there are long wait lists on these classes, that there are many more people who would want to learn English and participate in your services. So I think advocacy is really important to get more funding for these classes, as well as other services that you can offer. Making resources available in the community is also a very important role that libraries have, because many immigrant families might not know where else can they turn for additional resources. What are those community-based organizations that are accessible to them? So the library becomes that central location where they can go and ask questions and get answers to those questions related to services and opportunities that are available and accessible in their communities.
Awesome. And Shenzhan, I know since you are doing a little bit of library ESOL conversation groups now, just kind of what are ways that kind of how to get involved, or also just ways that we can grow these types of programs in the library itself too as well.
Yeah, I agree absolutely everything what Andrea mentioned. And also I want to congratulate the library already doing an amazing job. I feel from my experience, the ESL conversation group we started online, it just reaching out not only people in New York that geographically the library typically reaches, but also across the globe. So I find really there are, especially now we are doing many things online, and how that would perhaps make some changes the way that the library reaches out. That could be making the resources and the opportunities more accessible to people. And I know libraries typically have it's pretty much like centralized in the neighborhood that it is located, and really being this amazing resource center. And also I feel exchange of information and ideas. I find forums like today, bringing people from different backgrounds and different voices to really talking about relevant issues. This is exactly, I feel, a library it should be doing, and we are here having this discussion and really feel connected with the library on the one hand, and also with people who we may not necessarily encountering in our daily routinized and now very much home-based life.
And so speaking about home-based life, so I'm going to bump this next question to Andrea, is in terms of virtual learning. You had mentioned also for yourself, you've used Zoom pre-pandemic, but it's become even more imperative during this time. And so what are ways that we can ensure that we can still be providing these ESOL services in a virtual setting and making sure they're still getting the same experience?
I think we have to recognize that the experience might not be the same, since this is our new normal in which we live in this virtual world. As I mentioned to you as we were preparing, we are guests in each other's homes. We are visiting each other from around the United States just by looking at the participants represented in this list. And we have to recognize that these are difficult times to set up classes, learning opportunities in the same way. So with that said, it also allows us opportunities for innovation. So we could do new things that we have not thought of previously. I'm just thinking about synchronous and asynchronous classes, on-demand classes, pre-recorded classes, something that many of our English learners really appreciate if they can listen to the same thing again and again. And they could watch that same video, or if it's a game-like interactive simulated kind of learning environment in which using Edpuzzle or many other tools, they could try out their responses to one particular prompt and maybe get feedback from their classmates, using Flipgrid, in which they can record themselves for about 90 seconds and invite their classmates to add a video recording as a response. So thinking again of synchronously and asynchronously to extend our students' learning into a new era, which we did not choose. We did not sign up for this. We're all here on this Zoom call, but we might have had a different conference or different experience had it not be our current situation. So I think we have to look at the silver lining, which is what kind of new learning opportunities will be available to our English learners and our ESOL teachers to maximize the learning opportunities, but not necessarily recreating what it would have been in the classroom, but using new tools and new methodologies to extend our students' learning opportunities.
And so, Andrea, I just wanted to quickly add, just because I'm taking mental notes for myself right now too, is in terms of you were saying tools like, you mentioned Flipgrid. What are other types of applications that you would recommend that you're using right now that are useful in the ESOL classroom?
Well, my top two favorites, one of them I already mentioned, which is Flipgrid. And then the other one is Padlet, that's Padlet. And every professional development and every course that I ever teach, I always use Padlet, which is basically an online bulletin board. You could post as if you put a sticky on a piece of paper. It's just recreated digitally, and it allows everybody to contribute a sentence, an image, then we can comment on each other's posts, and all of a sudden, without creating a whole big discussion board or using an expensive learning management system, you could interact and learn about a particular topic through the use of Padlet. But these are just two tools. I think there are so many more, and I would not want anybody to be limited to just a handful of tools. The tool that the teacher and the students are both comfortable with will be the most effective tool, because then people will participate and contribute to those learning experiences.
Exactly. And then bumping it back to Shenzhen, in terms of conversation group session, where traditionally we would sit in a circle and everyone's talking and almost like pass the feather in terms of everyone getting a chance to speak. In a virtual setting, it's so much different. So if you wanted to maybe talk about when you're doing these types of sessions, what are tools you're using, methods using, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, as well, Andrea was talking about technology. I was thinking about our conversational group, because we don't see each other, we hear each other. This kind of technology, presents both, I feel, advantages, because some people may feel more comfortable not being seen and feel more sort of letting themselves out to be able to speak, and some will feel more, I want to present myself in full picture. So I find, well, technology really presents different opportunities, well, for different students, and really, like Andrea mentioned, well, whatever the students and teachers feel most comfortable would be the best, well, to be used in the classroom. I find our conversational group really works as well, people calling in from different parts of the world and being able to carry on a conversation. And meanwhile, I'm also thinking going forward as well, we get out of the current situation. Technology already opens up these different ways of doing remote teaching, whether it's synchronized or asynchronized, and how to continue that, and while when we actually can meet in person, and how to combine that with the real person experience. Because well, we can do everything that we want. People have different level of comfort dealing with technology, but at the end of the day, we're humans and we want interactions, well, in person, the 3D version, not the 2D, as well we are experiencing now. So how to do a hybrid version that, well, we are leveraging the benefits of technology while we can also complement that with real person experience. So I don't have an answer for that, but I'm sure there will be ways of doing that supported by both the human power as well as technology.
And just to go off what you were saying, Shenzhen, it's very interesting to see how technology has affected all of us. I know we were all talking about that right before this. And so actually your answer kind of actually leads into my last question before we head into our audience Q&A. And so everyone is allowed to jump in with their thoughts on this. Is just, as we've been talking, ESOL, classrooms, conversation groups, it's been constantly changing and constantly evolving. What do you hope to see as standards in the ESOL classroom in the next 5 or 10 years?
That's a wonderful question. I'm seeing more integrated approaches to language instruction, language pedagogy, so that we're not just teaching language for its own sake, not just teaching listening, speaking, reading, writing as 4 isolated skills, but everything is more connected, as you started our conversation today, connecting it to big ideas, connecting it to our students' everyday realities, their backgrounds, their cultural and linguistic assets. So it is a much more dynamic way of working with this population that's acknowledging and recognizing multilingualism, as well as opportunities for learning about the world, not just learning English while we're doing that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea and Shenzhen.
Yeah, I just want to add on that, as we are talking about, we're bringing equity and inclusion and diversity into the classroom, and to have stories that's related to the students' own experiences and their own cultures. As we are talking about English ESL classrooms, and these stories, well, in English, so that, well, the language that students are learning can actually really being used to talk about their own culture in the language that they are learning. I feel as well the understanding of cultural identity and how dynamic that we're shaping this country's understanding of, well, what is American culture, how we bring the heritage, the culture, and individual experience into this narrative, and how we can talk about that in the same language, which is linguistically English. That I find, well, in the ESL classroom, I hope we can see more of that in the future. And I do want to also, as well, I'm thinking about the future, looking at the current situation. One big factor is how the overall immigration situation would evolve in the next few years, and how that would change our classroom. Because when we are talking about the classroom, it's students coming from other cultures. And if the overall political environment is putting that kind of, whether it's restriction, whether it's any major changes, well, to the population coming into this country, that's going to fundamentally change what the classroom we are looking at.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for speaking on our roundtable discussion about this. And so just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions for both Shenzhan and Andrea, please do write them into the chat to Kelly, and we'll get started with answering some of them. We do have a question actually right here. So someone from our audience wrote, sometimes new Americans have preconceived ideas about African Americans. What, if anything, do you teach about African Americans in the ESOL classroom? And I think this actually is a question where we can expand it, where it's not just to the ESOL students, but also how are we making sure that our teachers are covering this information as well. So whoever wants to go first to take the question, please feel free.
I think I'd like to acknowledge that since neither of us are African Americans, as Shenzhan mentioned earlier, we need to put ourselves in the position of being learners and educate ourselves, and reading some of the most current literature that's coming out. And one that I would strongly encourage every educator to read is Ibram Kendi's work on how to be an anti-racist. And it's one of the most powerful recent books that I have read. I will be happy to put it in the chat box so that everybody knows which book I'm talking about. And engaging in dialogue across racial and ethnic groups and identities about how we can best teach about the African American culture, the different, even in the different terminologies that are being used to describe Black Americans or African Americans, and how to be as accurate and inclusive about our language and our knowledge in our ESOL classrooms as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to add, as well, Andrea mentioned, well, we are learners of particular history, particular individuals in the context. And also I think and I constantly remind myself that we are not free from bias. So everyone, we come from certain time, space, and the experience that's defined by the time and space and the culture we are coming from. So we come from and based on certain bias. I find, if we acknowledge that, and as a teacher in the classroom, and to bring that attitude towards when we are encountering biased situations, towards whether African American or any other groups, I find that perhaps we could offer a helpful starting point.
Awesome. And so another question that we have in the audience is, how are students in these programs accessing the technology? Is it computers, tablets, or cell phones? Many of our students are using cell phones, which we found difficult.
So maybe I will start. The programs that, Joanne and I were talking about, the conversational groups, we are based on WebEx, and students can access, through computer or cell phone or tablets. It's more of an audio based. So these are the sort of really, it's, when we're talking about technology, it really is also in certain ways could limit what kind of students can access to certain resources. That's actually also a huge equity issue as well. We know that when the schools convert to online classes in March, how to make sure every student has the right device to be able to access online classes is a huge issue to begin with.
I just quickly double checked that the two tools that I recommended, both Flipgrid and Padlet, are accessible on iPhones, iPads, across all devices. So what we have found is that more and more apps or tools that we would be using in the classroom really work across different platforms. So that's really important. It's an equity issue. It's an accessibility issue. So we have to be very careful and try out whatever we are using on multiple devices to make sure that our students also have access to them.
Awesome. And then also one thing I myself would like to note in that is always making sure that you're available to help out with tech issues, audio issues, video issues, all of those things, making sure that you make it very clear to your students and your participants that you are there to help and that you are, you know, sometimes just making sure that people know that is very imperative to making sure that people have the best experience in your program. And so that's just my little tidbit on that. Someone did leave a comment that I just want to mention. Someone had mentioned in terms of talking about race, as well as the specifically the African-American experience in ESOL classrooms. One of our attendees did recommend inviting speakers from the African-American community to be a part of these ESOL class or conversation groups. And so thank you so much for that comment. I think that's a really good suggestion for a lot of these programs that we are hosting. And so I know if anyone does not have any other questions, I will say that we are nearing the 3 p.m. time. So I want to first say thank you so much to Shenzhan, Andrea. Thank you so much for being a part of our discussion today. I know I was taking notes myself, and I'm really excited to see what ESOL classrooms and conversations will be in the next upcoming 5 years. And thank you so much to Jeremy and Kelly, Kelly for introducing and just being such a great collaborator on this series, and also to Jeremy for just being so supportive for this webinar series. And this is actually the last one, the 6th webinar of 6. So, you know, thank you so much for joining us on this journey of just learning how to combat racism in libraries. I will note that both ESRT and PLS will be co-sponsoring or sponsoring some of the events at the NYLA conference this year. So please do go check it out. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.